Turn our Bibles to the 49th chapter of Genesis. We're going to be in Genesis 49, and if it's the Lord's will, our goal anyway is to complete these last couple of chapters now, Genesis 49 and 50. And I kind of messed this up last week I had the slides all kind of discombobulated, so I want to kind of share something that has often been brought out by commentators in the past, that the first two chapters of the book, Genesis 1 and 2, deal with generation. The name of the book kind of comes from that, is the idea of beginnings. But then the fall happened in chapter 3, and from chapter 3 through 11, where we get to the Tower of Babel, deals with degeneration, from the fall to the dispersion of tongues. And then the last, from chapter 12 through 50, deal with regeneration, as God begins unfolding the plan that he revealed back in chapter 3 when Eve had sinned, and he says that the seed of the woman would be the one who would bring about victory. Now, 17 years have passed from chapter 48 to 49, okay? Sometimes we're kind of reading it, and it just there's no really chapter break in the original text, and so we could lose sight of that pretty easily. But it's been 17 years since the reunion between Joseph and his father. And as we see, we're going to see Jacob in a light tonight that we've kind of seen it coming, but it's going to be in a light that we have not seen prior. And for me, it's been very encouraging seeing this growth in Jacob over from the time that we were first introduced to him when he was still inside his mother's womb, and he was grabbing a hold of Esau and trying to pull him back in. And he lived his whole life kind of after that credo up until these recent chapters. And it's been encouraging to me to see this growth in him, because I know there's hope for me. And I hope you can identify with that as well. And it says in verse 1 that he called his sons, and he said, "Gather together that I may tell you what shall befall you in the last days." We've seen several times in the book this thing that's called the principle of first mention. And that is the idea that the first time something is mentioned in the scriptures, oftentimes, not always, but oftentimes that first mention kind of sets the stage for the importance of the other mentions that you'll see later on. And this is the first time this is the first mention of the phrase "in the last times." Jacob is going from being a patriarch to being a prophet in chapter 48 and 49, or 49, 50. He says, "Gather together and hear, you sons of Jacob, and listen to Israel, your father." Remember, Israel was the name that the angel of the Lord gave him the night that they wrestled. And he said, "You've been called Jacob, but from here on out, you're going to be known as Israel." And he says, "Listen to Israel, your father." By the way, I was thinking of something about that today. Oftentimes we talk about the children of Israel. And as I was a kid growing up, I had this picture of these kids going around in the desert, the children of Israel. But what that means is that they were the children or the descendants of Israel, Jacob, and beginning with the 12 tribes. Tonight he's calling them all together, the 12 tribes, the 12 patriarchs, as they're sometimes called. And he is going to... it's called giving a blessing, but as we'll see in many cases, that's not what I would define as being a blessing. But in every case, it's somewhat prophetic as to what he's going to be doing. And there are some people that see in these two chapters the entire panorama of Israel's future. The nation of Israel is in these prophecies. And he starts off, he's going to go by the oldest to the youngest. He's going to start with Reuben and finish up with Benjamin. And he says, "Reuben, you are my firstborn, my might and the beginning of my strength, the excellency of dignity and the excellency of power." And you can picture Reuben standing up, kind of straightening out the folds of his robe and go, "Yeah, you got that right," And then but Jacob continues, "You're as unstable as water. You shall not excel, because you went up to your father's bed, then you defiled it. He went up to my couch." Unstable as water. Water is fluid. Water kind of goes wherever it's unimpeded to go. And it always flows from upper to lower. It always goes downhill. And that's a very apt description of what was being borne out in Reuben's life. It's kind of a good metaphor for unbridled lust. Unstable as water, unbridled lust. And if you remember back in chapter 35, where Reuben went in right after the story about Rachel and her dying, Jacob's true love, and she died and he buried her, and then I don't know what time frame had passed. I don't know if there was any passage of time, but then the very next story is Reuben going into Jacob's concubine and laying with her. And in the Old Testament times, when you did that, it was kind of an act of usurpation. You know, it was kind of like you were when remember when David's son did that with one of his concubines, and it was a statement that I'm taking over your kingdom, I'm taking over your power. You can't stop me from doing this. You can't stop me from doing anything. And I'm not sure if that was behind Reuben's act then or not. We don't see anything following from it. There was no attempt on his part to try to take over the family lineage, as we can tell. But it certainly is a type of, it's a picture, it's a demonstration of unbridled lust. And Reuben is a kind of guy, maybe you know somebody like this. Not nobody here, of course, but maybe you know somebody like this. Reuben was the kind of guy that was led by the moment. You know, whatever he wanted to do in that moment, that was more important than anything else. If he felt like doing it, he did it. If it itched, he scratched it. Reuben's tribe, when they go into the promised land, and we're going to be looking at a lot of these tonight, when they finally got into the land of Canaan some 400 and almost 50 years later, they came into land and they were allotted certain tribal parameters. And Reuben was the first one to settle when they started coming up on the Trans-Jordan side from down in the desert. He settled. He wanted the area that was between Moab and Ammon, who were kind of perennial enemies of Israel. And as a result of it, it was good pasture land back then. It's kind of a desert area now. But back then it was pretty good land, and he wanted that, even though it wasn't necessarily what God's perfect will for him was. He was going to settle for God's permissive will. And he settled there between Ammon and Moab. And as a result, whenever there was any threats on the nation, he was one of the first ones to fall because he was detached from the rest of the nation. And he was vulnerable in between these two countries of Moab and Ammon. No leaders ever come out of Reuben. You know, where he should have been the firstborn. He should have been the guy that led the rest of the family. He should have been the predominant one, and yet he kind of his progeny kind of just fizzles around into impotence. He's kind of a type of the person that gets, you probably heard it before, fire insurance salvation. You know, they just want to make sure, they want to get their fire insurance. They want to make sure that they're going to go to heaven when they die. They don't care about anything else. They're not cared about doing the will of God. They're not concerned about sanctification, or they're not concerned about making any changes in their life. They just want to be saved just enough that when they die, they're going to go to heaven. That's Reuben. That's the kind of guy he is. And then he says, Simeon and Levi are brothers. Instruments of cruelty are in their dwelling place. Let not my soul enter their council, and let my honor be united with their assembly. Let not my honor be united to their assembly. For in their anger they slew a man, and in their self-will they hamstrung an ox. Remember when their sister Dinah was raped by the prince of Shechem. That was the place. And they agreed to have this kind of a peace treaty between the sons of Israel and the king of Shechem. And they made that arrangement. And then in the middle of the night, Levi and Simeon and all of their posse, you know, they had their hired hands and their men servants. They went in at night and they slew not just simply the son of the king of Shechem, but all of the male inhabitants of the city. And Jacob was very bothered by this. And he says, in their anger, they slew a man. In their self-will, they hamstrung an ox. Different translations talk about that they injured the oxen just because they wanted to, just because they felt like it is what some of the modern English translations say. In the Old King James, it says that in their self-will, they dig down a wall. Now, I don't know how you get hamstrung an ox from dig down a wall. I'm sure it's some sort of a textual thing, but I couldn't find anything out about that. And he continues as he's talking about Simeon and Levi, and he says, "Cursed be their anger, for it's fierce, and their wrath, for it's cruel. I will divide them in Jacob and scatter them in Israel." Now, the Levites kind of, of course, the Levites are the priestly tribe, and they redeemed themselves in a couple of ways. One was when they first left Egypt, and Moses went back up on the mountain, and he was up there getting the Ten Commandments, and the children of Israel wanted Aaron, Moses' brothers, to make them a golden calf. And it was the tribe of Levi that stood against that, withstood that. They were saying, no, we can't do that because you can't make an image of the imageless God. And so there was that. They also were the ones that when toward the end of the wilderness wanderings, when the Moabites sent their women down into camp to kind of lead the Israelites astray so that God would, so that God would curse them, that he would bring down wrath on the Moabites. And it was a Levite that came in, Phinehas, that came and stabbed the Moabite guy and the Moabite gal and the Israelite guy to stop the curse. So the Levites kind of redeemed themselves from this curse. But the Simeonites, when they gave the tribal divisions, they were actually contained. They were surrounded by the tribe of Judah. And within just a few generations, they were absorbed into the tribe. They lost all their tribal distinctions. You hear a reference here and there to somebody that was of the tribe of Simeon, but they never amounted to anything. In verse 8 says, Judah, which means praise. His name means, in Hebrew, is Yehuda, and it means praise. You are he whom your brothers shall praise. Your hand shall be on the neck of your enemies. And your father's children shall bow down before you. We've seen over the last few weeks, if you've been with us each week, we've seen how Judah's cream has kind of risen to the top. He has taken the leadership of the family. When Joseph, before he had revealed himself, and he was going to hold Simeon hostage and said, go back and get Benjamin. And if you don't bring him back, you won't get to see Simeon again. And Judah has said, if I don't bring Benjamin back, let me take Ben down there, and if I don't bring him back, you can have my life in return. He was willing to sacrifice his life in order to preserve his brothers. And since then, he's really kind of come to the top. And so Israel, Jacob, is recognizing that. And he says, Judah is a lion's whelp, verse 9. From the prey, my son, you have gone up. He bows down. He lies down like a lion. As a lion, who shall rouse him? The scepter shall not depart from Judah, nor a lawgiver from between his feet, until Shiloh comes, and to him shall be the obedience of the people. And so he spends more verses on Judah than all the other sons, and this is all praise. Jacob is giving him praise. And he says, there's not going to be, the scepter will not depart from Judah, nor a lawgiver from between his feet until Shiloh comes. Now, this phrase, this word Shiloh, the only place it occurs in the Bible, it's a very obscure word. Some of the translators think that it has as its root shalom, that comes from that idea of peace. But they're not sure. But they are all pretty universally, the Hebrew scholars from antiquity up even to the present time, they all believe that it is messianic. That is, something has to do with the Messiah. And it says that the scepter shall not depart from Judah. In other words, the idea of being the ruler of the nation is not going to end until the Messiah arises. And that was their belief back then. It's still the belief of the majority of the Jewish people today. In Genesis chapter 9, at the end of the flood, when the ark came to rest on Ararat and Moses came out and he offered a sacrifice, and it was at that point that God instituted human government. After the flood, and the very first tenet of human government in Genesis 9:6 was the right of capital punishment. And this is the eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth sort of thing. It says if somebody takes a life, then his life shall be forfeited as a result of that. And that is something that the Israelites held sacrosanct for centuries. The idea of the right that God had given them of capital punishment. Now, Jesus was born about somewhere around 6 BC. And people say, well, I thought he was born in zero, the year zero, because we figure time from that. Well, the guys that first did the calendars were messed up. They got off a few years. And we can kind of determine it somewhat by comparing what the Bible says about Jesus' birth and his early years with secular history. So he was born somewhere around the year 6 BC. And these dates are somewhat approximate, but they fit. It was about 12 years later that the Roman Caesar took away the right of the Jewish leadership, the Sanhedrin, took the right of capital punishment away from them about 12 years later. And to the priests, when this was done, around 6, 7 AD, when they took that right away, the priests were convinced that Genesis 49 had been broken. In fact, the priests tore their robes and they went walking through the streets of Jerusalem wailing, and they were believing that, according to the Talmud, it says later that woe to us, for the scepter has departed from Judah and the Messiah has not come. And even through all of their times of captivity and the times when they were paying tribute to other nations, they still, within their little area, whatever, even when they were in Babylonia and in Persia and so forth, they still had the right within their form of government, of their religion, to exercise capital punishment. And yet the Romans took that away from them, and the Messiah had not been revealed yet. But if they had only realized, if they had eyes to see, they would have realized that probably at that very same time that the Romans took this right of capital punishment away, there was a young 12-year-old boy in the temple named Jesus who was blowing the rabbis' minds with his insight into the scriptures. Genesis 3:15 is what's known as the proto-evangelium, which means it's the first mention of the gospel. And this is that through the seed of the woman, I'm going to crush Satan's head. And he said in that promise that the Messiah is going to come through the seed of the woman. Well, a lot of people were born from Eve. Okay, there were a lot of people, so that's not a very specific kind of promise. But then when we get a few millennia later, he says, but it's not only going to come through Eve, but it's going to come through, the Messiah is going to come through Abraham. And that eliminated all other descendants of Adam. And then Abraham had two sons, right? He had two sons, Isaac and Ishmael, but he says it's not going to come through Ishmael, the child of the flesh. It's going to come through Isaac, the child of the promise. And so half of all of Abraham's descendants were eliminated through that prophecy. And then later it would be said that it would not come through Esau. Isaac had two sons, Jacob and Esau, and he says the Messiah is not going to come through Esau, it's going to come through Jacob. And then Jacob had 12 sons, and he says it's not going to come through any of the 11 sons, only through the line of the tribe of Judah. This prophecy that's given to us here in chapter 49. And so it eliminated all the other 11/12 of Jacob's descendants. And that prophecy continues to get narrowed down even further as we get closer to the time of the close of the Old Testament. And it says, continuing on about Judah, it says, and binding his donkey to the vine and his donkey's colt to the choice vine, he washed his garments in wine and his clothes in the blood of grapes. And his eyes are darker than wine and his teeth whiter than milk. Now, some of the commentators say that what this is talking about, where he says that he washes his clothes, well, first of all, the donkey being tied to the vine. Now, if you had a vineyard back in those days and you had a donkey, you would not tether your donkey to the vineyard. You wouldn't tether it to the vine because it'd eat your grapes. And so this prophecy is that through Judah is going to come such prosperity that you ain't going to care whether your donkey's tied to the vine or not. You're just going to tie him up and say, hey, eat all the grapes you want. I got plenty more. And that's what most commentators see this is saying. And when it says that he washes his garments in wine, many of them say, well, that's like saying that, wine was kind of like, that was a very precious thing back in those days. That was the best liquid you could have, and is saying that wine is going to be so common, so every day, that it's going to be like dishwater, like laundry soap, laundry water, that you're just going to wash your clothes in it because it doesn't care. You don't care that it's a waste of good wine or not. And then the teeth whiter than milk, meaning they're going to have really good dentist coverage back in those days as well. Now that may be what's being implied here through in the last part of verse 11 and verse 12. But other guys, and I tend to kind of lean this way, that is, they see it as a reference to the millennial kingdom, where it says in Isaiah chapter 63, and this is a prophecy concerning the millennium, and it says in Isaiah chapter 63, verse 1, that he says, "Who is this who's coming with dyed garments from Bozrah? This one who is glorious in his apparel, traveling in the strength of his greatness." And then the question is answered by the person who comes from Bozrah, and he said, "It is I who speak in righteousness, mighty to save." And so they said, "Well, why is your apparel red, and your garments like one who treads in the winepress?" And then the person responds again, "I have trodden the winepress alone, and from the peoples no one was with me. For I have trodden them in my anger, and trampled them in my fury, and their blood is sprinkled on my garments, and I've stained all my robes. For the day," this is verse 4, "for the day of vengeance is in my heart, and the year of my redeemed has come." So this is a prophecy regarding the very end of the tribulation time period. After the 7 years of tribulation, Jesus is going to come back. This is literally the second coming of Christ. He will come back, and he originally comes back in the area of what's today southeast Jordan, around the area of Bozrah, or also today it's known as the area of Petra, where the rock city is. He's going to come back there first, I think, and deliver the Jews that are being hidden out there. And then he's going to come back to the city of Jerusalem. It's where he puts his foot down and causes the big earthquake. And people are going to say, "Well, who is this guy that's coming with his, the Civil War song about trampling out the vintage?" This is a reference to Isaiah 63. And he said, "Well, who is this who's come with his garments all stained with looks like they're stained with wine?" He said, "No, it's stained with blood, the blood of my enemies." And it's Jesus when he comes back in the second coming to deal with the Antichrist and the king of the north and the king of the east, and he takes care of business and then ushers in the millennium, which will bring about this utopian society, this literal utopian society that is spoken of, where you're going to have donkeys tied to grapevines and really nice white shiny teeth, and so it's going to be followed by, after this time of judgment, be followed by a utopia. Is it a utopia or an utopia? Anybody? How many say a utopia? Okay, how many say an utopia? Okay, all the an-utopias move over to this side, and then all you a-utopias come over to this side, okay? Because we're going to have a church split right now. And me, I'm going to stay right in the middle, okay? I'm like the dead skunk. I'm going to be right down the middle of the road because I don't want to offend anybody. So it's a or an utopia, as the only thing in the middle of the roads are dead skunks and yellow stripes. That's me. So I'm not taking I don't have a dog in the hunt. But some people say that that's what this is talking about. And I would lean that way. Others see that it may be not a reference to his second coming when he comes at the end of the tribulation, but at the end of this millennial period, this utopian society, at the end of that, when Satan is released from the bottomless pit after he's been bound there for 1,000 years, and he comes back on earth and he tries to start this very last rebellion against the Lamb. And we read about this in Revelation chapter 20, verse 7, where it says, "Now, when the 1,000 years have expired," this millennia, 1,000 years, Satan will be released from his prison, and he will go out to deceive the nations which are in the four corners of the earth, Gog and Magog, to gather them together to battle, whose number is as the sand of the sea. And they went up to the breadth on the breadth of the earth and surrounded the camp of the saints in the beloved city. And then fire came down from God out of heaven and devoured them. And the devil who deceived them was cast into the lake of fire and brimstone, where the beast and the false prophet are. They were put there 1,000 years ago. They're still there roasting. And then the devil and all his followers that had followed him in this last ditch effort of rebellion are cast in the lake of fire as well. And they will be tormented day and night forever and ever. And then it will be followed by the new heaven and the new earth. So the second coming of Christ at the end of tribulation will be followed by the millennium. At the end of the millennium, Satan tries another rebellion. God will just kind of like destroy them with just say, be gone with you, and they're destroyed. And then that will usher in the new heaven and the new earth. Some lean toward that. It could be either one. I kind of lean toward the millennial prophecy because it seems to fit better. Verse 13 says, And Zebulun shall dwell by the haven of the sea, and he shall become a haven for ships, and his border shall adjoin Sidon. Now, the problem is, we'll see in a second, is that Zebulun was not a coastal tribe. They didn't dwell on the coast. But it says, And then Issachar is a strong donkey lying down between two burdens. And he saw that rest was good, that the land was pleasant, and bowed his shoulder to bear a burden that and became a band of slaves. Zebulun was laying in a very prosperous trade route. It wasn't on the coast, but it was close to the coast, and the ships would come there. The Acre is the ruins of Acre are there today, and it was one major seaport back in those days. And then Zebulun lay on this trade route where the ships would come in on the Mediterranean, and then they would offload their ships, and then they would go toward the east, and they would travel right through Zebulun. So it was as though they were on the coast. And they within the borders of Zebulun was the Jezreel Valley, or the Valley of Megiddo is how it's known today. And it's probably one of the most verdant, fertile farmlands in the world. If you've ever had a chance to see it, it's breathtaking in its scope. And this is where Zebulun was. And so, they had it pretty cool. And then Issachar was right below them in the area that's known as Lower Galilee. And it was also a very prosperous area. And where it says that he bowed his shoulder to bear a burden, it was the idea of you picture a donkey that's laden down with his stuff, and he just doesn't want to work anymore, so he just lays his burden down. And that's kind of how it was with Issachar. They both had it so well, so cush, so easy. They lived in this probably the best part of Israel, and yet they took it for granted and they became lazy. And they were also the first to fall to the Assyrians. When the Assyrian conquest came in the 8th century, they were the first of the northern tribes to fall. Chapter 6, verse 16, Dan, which his name means judge. Okay, the name Dan means judge. And he says, he shall judge his people. So Dan shall Dan his people, literally, as one of the tribes of Israel. Dan shall be a serpent by the way, a viper by the path, that bites the horse's heels so that its rider shall fall backward. Now, Dan was originally allotted this very nice coastal property. I mean, they had this Malibu kind of seafront sort of an area. And they weren't satisfied with that. And so they went scoping out the rest of the land and seeing if they could find something that they liked a little better. And they went up into, it's the foothills of the Golan Heights, north of the Sea of Galilee, and they found a city named Laish that was very unprotected. And so they went up there, burned down the city, killed all the inhabitants, rebuilt the city, and named it Dan. And they just kind of moved their whole tribe up there. But when they did, they also brought with them idolatry. And they were the first of the tribes of Israel to fall victim of idolatry. Not only in the beginning, when they were still in their tribal state, but then after the division of the nations between Rehoboam and Jeroboam, when they divided the northern kingdom from the southern kingdom. And it was Jeroboam had set up a pagan altar. Just they already had the altar there before that the Laishites had been worshiping at, that Dan had inherited and was worshiping idols on it. And so Jeroboam said, well, we'll just put a church there and we'll continue worshiping idols up there. So That's Dan. Dan was not a good example of a descendant of Jacob. He didn't represent the tribes of Israel very well at all. In fact, in um, First Chronicles, where when you're going through the Bible, reading your devos, you're going through the Bible in a year or whatever it is, and you come to First Chronicles, and you get to chapter 1, and you start seeing where it's and so begat so and so and so and so begat so and so and so and so begat so and so and so. It goes on for 9 chapters. So you just skip from chapter 1 verse 1 all the way to chapter 1 verse 10 or chapter 10 verse 1, don't you? You just skip all over that because too many begats. Well, Dan is not mentioned in those begats. I take that back. He is mentioned as a son of Jacob when it's giving Jacob's genealogy and says, "On Jacob begat Dan." But then all the other brothers, it goes through all of their descendants, except Dan is eliminated. It's kind of like he ceases to exist after his generation, as far as First Chronicles go. Also, in the book of Revelation, in chapter 7, where you have the 12,000 from each of the 12 tribes, the 144,000, and it's during the tribulation, and the 144,000 Jews, Messianic Jews, are called by the Lord to go throughout the world preaching the gospel. And Dan is not one of them. He's eliminated from that as well because, somebody who's involved in idolatry, somebody who has a wishy-washy life. Like one day they're worshiping God, the next day they're worshiping something else or someone else or somewhere else. That's not a very good witness. That compromised life is not. And Dan was the epitome of the compromised life. And so he's not listed in the book of Revelation either. And then out of the blue, as he's going down here, he's kind of Jacob. I mean, he's on his deathbed, but he's kind of worked up some energy here. He's going through all of his different sons, and right after he gets done with Dan, he just says in verse 18 that just kind of almost like he had this kind of an ADD moment where he loses track of what he's talking about. But he says, "I have waited for your salvation, O Lord." And the Hebrew word for salvation is the word shua. Okay. That's a Hebrew word that means to save or salvation. That's not the word that Jacob uses here, though. He doesn't say Yeshua. He uses Yeshua. Jehovah is salvation. And he says, "I have waited for your salvation, O Lord. I have waited for your Yeshua." It's the first time, interesting, we've gone all the way through the entire book of Genesis, and this is the first time we see the word salvation mentioned. And as we see the principle of first mention, so this is the first time it's mentioned, and it bears light on the rest of the time we see the word salvation. And Jacob is kind of like in the middle of saying these prophecies over his sons, and then he just goes, "Lord, I really did believe that you were going to come back in my lifetime. That Genesis 3:15 was going to be fulfilled in my lifetime. I thought that I would see Shiloh come. I thought that I would see your salvation. I have waited for your salvation, O Lord." And I believe that every man of God, every woman of God since then has hoped and waited and wished for the same thing, right? I mean, how I have waited for your salvation, O Lord. How I have longed for the culmination of Genesis 3:15 to happen in my lifetime. And what Jacob is saying is that it didn't happen in my lifetime, okay, but I'm going to wait and keep on waiting. As long as there's breath in me, I'm going to wait. And what Jacob had come to the place in his life where he realized that everything else was irrelevant. He'd finally grown to the place where God was the focus of everything. And he was going to be in a position that however Shiloh was going to come, however the fulfillment of Genesis 3:15 was going to reveal itself, he was going to be found waiting. And that doesn't mean like all chill with the clicker and that kind of waiting. Waiting as though he was anticipating it at any moment. I mean, if I knew, not just simply expecting, but if I knew that Jesus was going to come for me tomorrow, if I had if I were to say, I just witnessing's not really my thing. I'm not just really good in kind of sharing my faith with people I don't know and everything. And sometimes if I build a relationship with them and they get to know me, I might share it. But it's just, some people have to get to the evangelism. It's just not my gift. And if that were me, and I knew that tomorrow Jesus was going to come for the church, I would turn into a witnessing machine, right? And what Jacob is saying is that's the way that it took me long to get here, but I want my life to be focused in that anxious expectation of the Lord coming, that his salvation would be realized. Verse 19 says Gad, which the word, Dan means judge, Gad means troop, like a group of guys, a squad of soldiers, a troop. Gad a troop shall tramp on him, but he shall triumph at last. It's interesting, the word troop, tramp, and triumph are all derivatives of the word Gad. And so it's just kind of like the whole thing here is kind of a play on words. And Gad was also, remember Reuben and Gad and then the half tribe of Manasseh, they all wanted to settle on the Transjordan side. And so it was also one of the first ones to fall when things got rough. He says, bread from Asher, verse 20, shall be rich, and he shall yield royal dainties. Asher, the name Asher means happy. Okay? And he says, bread from Asher will be rich. They're going to be known. He's just saying they're going to be masters of the culinary art of baking. They're going to know how to take some grain and do wonders. The Asher won the cake wars 5 seasons in a row. They were just they really knew how to do this. And it says, and the bread from Asher will not be sweet. The bread from Asher will not be really, really good. He says the bread from Asher is going to be rich. They were in charge of making all the baklava. It's kind of like, oh, this is really good, but it's just too rich. That's what they did. And it said that it will yield royal dainties. Verse 21, Naphtali is a deer set loose, and he uses beautiful words. Interesting. Naphtali, it's on the Galilee, right? It's kind of in between Issachar and what was the other one to its west? Anyway, it's right in there in the Galilee area. And Jesus and all of the disciples, with the exception of Judas was from this place called Issachar, or Iscariot, I think is what they think the name of the city was. But Jesus and all of the disciples except Judas came from Naphtali. And it says Naphtali is a deer set loose. He uses beautiful words. As Jesus came and began preaching the good news of the kingdom, and then his disciples picked it up and took it from there. They were the first to bring the good news, beautiful words. Joseph is a fruitful bough by a well, and his branches run over the wall. The archers have bitterly grieved him and shot at him and hated him, but his bow remained in strength, and the arms of his hands were made strong. And by the hands of the mighty God of Jacob, from there is the shepherd, the stone of Israel. It's he now comes to Joseph, and he was a fruitful bough. He was all built up and fortified, and he was the richest, he was the strongest, he was the most powerful of all of Jacob's sons by the time we come to chapter 49. And he had been done dirty by his brothers. And he could have taken vengeance, but he didn't. And he's such a type of Jesus in this. And he was faithful. Through the entire story, as we've been looking at the life of Joseph, he never once ever fell from trusting God that has been recorded for us anyway. And he was faithful, but God was mighty. And of course, as a type of Jesus, this is not only true of Joseph, but also of Jesus. First mention of God as being a shepherd is here, and also the first mention of God being the rock. It says here that he was the stone of Israel, the rock of Israel. By the God of your father, verse 25, who will help you, and by the Almighty who will bless you with blessings of heaven above, the blessings of the deep that lies beneath, and blessings of the breasts and of the womb, and blessings of your father have excelled the blessings of my ancestors, up to the utmost bound of the everlasting hills. They shall be on the head of Joseph, and on the crown of the head of him who was separate from his brothers. Of course, Joseph or Jacob took Joseph's two sons, Ephraim and Manasseh, and adopted them. And so when he's talking about Joseph here, as far as the blessings goes, he's passing those on to Joseph's sons, Ephraim and Manasseh. And many of Israel's heroes came from them. Ephraim was the Joshua came from Ephraim, and so did Samuel, the prophet priest. And then Manasseh, from Manasseh came Gideon and Jephthah, two of the judges of Israel. The word separate here in the verse 26, the word separate, he was separate from his brothers. That's the word Nazir, from where our word Nazarite comes from. The Nazarite vow, which means you would separate yourselves as a way of consecration to the Lord for a period of time. That will be covered in Numbers, and that's where the word comes from. Nazarite comes from the word Nazir. Excuse me. Benjamin is a ravenous wolf, and in the morning he shall devour the prey, and at night he shall divide the spoil. The Benjamites, they were, as far as the allotment goes, they were one of the smallest of the 12 tribes. They had the least people, and they were just given a little part, but they were known for their warriorship. I mean, they were known to be bad soldiers. You didn't want to mess with the Benjamites, but they were kind of like unbridled in that. Like a ravenous wolf. They were the ones in Judges chapter 20 where they got that really crazy story about they took this guy's concubine and they took turns with her and then dropped her off on the doorstep. They were kind of like that, they were just sort of no holds barred sort of guys. The two Sauls, Saul, the first king of Israel, and Saul, who was the Apostle Paul, they both came from Benjamin. And they were both kind of guys that just whatever they set their mind to, they went for it with all that they had. And that's kind of what where the first Saul was a ravenous wolf with the things of his own flesh. The second Saul was a ravenous wolf with the things of the Lord. Neither one of them were very restrained. And all of these, he says in verse 28, are the 12 tribes of Israel. And this is what their father spoke to them, and he blessed them and blessed each one according to his own blessing. It's very interesting to me, in all of the weeks that we've been studying the sons of Jacob, this is the first mention of the 12 tribes. First time that they've been called the 12 tribes of Israel. And he charged them and said to them, I am to be gathered to my people. Bury me with my fathers in the cave that is in the field of Ephron the Hittite, in the cave that is by the field of Machpelah, which is before Mamre in the land of Canaan, which Abraham bought in the field of Ephron the Hittite as a possession for a burial place. And so there they buried Abraham and Sarah his wife, and they also buried Isaac and Rebekah his wife, and there Jacob says, I buried Leah. It's interesting to me that Rachel was buried down by Bethlehem, and Leah was buried there in the ancestral tomb. It's interesting to me that Jacob wanted to be buried with Leah rather than Rachel. And I don't really know what the reason for that is. I don't think it's so much that he didn't want to be buried with Rachel as much as he wanted to be buried by Leah. That he had learned to love her over the period of their years, which is kind of cool. The field and the cave that is there were purchased from the sons of Heth, he continues. And when Jacob had finished commanding his sons, he drew up his feet into the bed, breathed his last, and there was gathered to his people. It's kind of like a movie sort of ending kind of a thing, isn't it? And it says, Joseph fell on his father's face and wept over him and kissed him. Many years had been taken away from Joseph and Jacob through this deception of their brothers. And yet when the reunion had taken place, Joseph had never missed a chance to show his love for his father. Jacob never missed a chance to do likewise. And it's kind of like, we see, Jacob, when Jacob died, Joseph just repeatedly fell on his father and wept without restraint, and we only have one opportunity. This is a good lesson from this. This is something that's worthy of all of us to take note. We only have one opportunity to express our love to our loved ones. It says Joseph commanded his servants, the physicians, to embalm his father. So the physicians embalmed Israel. 40 days were required of him, for such are the days required for those who are embalmed. And the Egyptians mourned for him 70 days. So Joseph is following the Egyptian form of embalming, the mummification process. And have you ever heard how they do that? I mean, they suck the brains out through the nostrils. That's the first step, is to remove their brains. And they don't want to mess with the face because they didn't want to go into the afterlife with a messed up face. So they would just kind of suck out their brains through the nostrils. Now, for some people, that wouldn't take very much. It would take a long time. It'd be hard for me because I have a deviated septum. I mean, it'd be just kind of hard to get the thing up in there. But that's what they would take out the brains, and then over this month and a half process, they would go through the embalming thing, and we'll see that wasn't a process that was followed by the rest of the Israelites later. But when the days of his mourning were past, they mourned for Jacob almost as long as they would mourn for Pharaoh. The rule, the law for mourning for a dead Pharaoh was 77 days. And so here for Jacob, they mourned for 70 days. And when the days were past, Joseph spoke to the household of Pharaoh, saying, now, if I have found favor in your eyes, please, in the hearing of Pharaoh, please speak in the hearing of Pharaoh, saying, notice something here. Joseph is not quite at the position that he'd been before. Just 17 years have gone by. They're not having this time of famine anymore. He's still a very rich guy, because Pharaoh gave him all this stuff. Don't know if it's the same Pharaoh now or not, but he's not in the same position of importance that he was in before. He can't go into Pharaoh's presence. Before it says, I'm like a father to Pharaoh. I can go into court anytime I want to. He can't do that now, so he has to talk to someone else to do it. And he says, go to him and say, my father made me swear, saying, behold, I am dying. And in my grave, which I dug for myself in the land of Canaan, there you shall bury me. And so therefore, please let me go up and bury my father, and I'll come back. And Pharaoh said, well, go bury your father as he made you swear. So Joseph went up to bury his father with him and with all the servants of Pharaoh, the elders of his house, and all the elders of the land of Egypt, as well as all the house of Joseph, his brothers, and his father's house. Only their little ones and their flocks and their herds they left in the land of Goshen. Probably because it would have been too tiring of a journey to take everybody. So it was not only Joseph and his brothers and all of their peeps, but it was all of Pharaoh's peeps too. All of the elders of Egypt. And I mean, they had this big caravan, and it was all the mucky-to-mucks going up. And this is Joe's first time in Canaan in 39 years. He was 17 years old when he left, and now he's in his mid-50s. And there went up with him both chariots and horsemen, and it was a very great gathering. And then they came to the threshing floor of Atad, which is beyond the Jordan, and they mourned there with a great and very solemn lamentation. And they observed 7 days of mourning for his father. And when the inhabitants of the land, the Canaanites, saw the mourning at the threshing floor of Atad, they said, this is the deep mourning of the Egyptians. And so therefore, its name was called Abel Mitzrayim, which is beyond the Jordan. And Abel Mitzrayim means the mourning of Egypt. It can also mean the meadow of Egypt. If you look it up in a dictionary or something, you see sometimes it can also mean meadow of Egypt, but the context would tell you that it's this meaning. And his son did for him just as he had commanded him. For his sons carried him to the land of Canaan and buried him in the cave of the field of Machpelah before Mamre, which Abraham bought with the field from Ephron the Hittite as a property for a burial place. So he bought this big place where they carved out some caves, and that's where the family crypt is. And after he had buried his father, Joseph returned to Egypt, he and his brothers, and all who went up with him to bury his father. And it says, when Joseph's brothers saw that their father was dead, so after this is all done, and the burial's all done and everything, they said, perhaps Joseph will hate us and may actually repay us for all the evil that we did to him. Joseph, as a type of Jesus, we're going to see the way Joseph handles this. And there's a really valuable lesson here, because it's not humility to not accept forgiveness. You know what I mean when I say that? That's not an act of humility. Sometimes people think, well, I'm just not worthy of forgiveness, and so it's kind of like we're just saying that as a way of, I'm just, I say with all humility, I'm not worthy of the forgiveness. And to say that, if we say that I know that Jesus forgives me, but I can't forgive me, that's not an act of humility. That's a denial of the work of Jesus. That's saying that okay, it's the blood of Jesus plus the fact that I need to do something worthy of forgiveness. And there's nothing that we can add to His blood-bought grace that changes the fact that He died for our sins. And that's an important lesson to know, I think. It says they sent messengers to Joseph saying, "Before your father died." So this is the 11 brothers. They get together and think, Joe's going to come and unglued on us now. So they sent some messengers to go kind of pave the way. And they said, "Go to him and say, before your father died, he commanded, saying, thus you shall say to Joseph." We didn't say anything about this before when Daddy was alive, but we need to tell you this now, because he said, "I beg you, please forgive the trespasses of your brothers and their sin, for they did evil to you." Now, we don't have any record that Jacob ever said that. I don't think Jacob did ever say that. I think this is just the brothers trying to cover their bases. And so they said, you can't go against our father's dying wishes, so you can't take out vengeance on us. So now please forgive the trespass of the servants of the God of your father. And Joseph wept when they spoke to him. When Joseph heard that they were thinking that he was going to... Now remember, they've been together for 17 years now. And Joseph is thinking, if you haven't figured out that that's not what I want yet, that what I want is not, I don't want servants, I want brothers. And it was breaking Joseph's heart that they wouldn't accept that. And so then his brothers also went and fell down before his face, and they said, "Behold, we're your servants." And Joseph said to them, "Do not be afraid. Am I in the place of God?" Now, he'd never read in the Bible where it says vengeance is the Lord's. He'd never read that because it hadn't been written yet. And yet Joseph knew that vengeance was the Lord's. And he said, "Am I in the place of God that I would take vengeance on you?" And then verse 20 says, "But as for you, you meant evil against me, but God meant it for good, in order to bring it about as it is to this day, to save many people alive." And I'm pausing now to give you the opportunity to underline that verse, because everybody should have this one underlined. Even if you're not using your own Bible, go ahead and underline it anyway. And don't worry about putting it in pencil that you can erase it later. Do it in ink. This should be a verse that we all have really worked down deep inside us. You meant it for evil, but God meant it for good. You meant it for bad stuff, but God was using the bad stuff to bring about good stuff. This is the Word of God, period. I know that Romans 8:28 has been so overused that it's kind of lost its punch. And that when somebody's in the middle of grieving, you don't want to go up to them and say, "Well, the Bible says that Romans 8:28, and quote how God's going to bring good things out of these bad things." I know sometimes that falls kind of like lead to a grieving heart, but it's the Word of God. It's the Bible. Jeremiah 29, starting with verse 11. And I understand the context of this when Jeremiah gave it, but I think it's still relevant for us. "For I know the thoughts that I think toward you, says the Lord, thoughts of peace and not of evil, to give you a future and a hope. And then you will call upon me and go and pray to me, and I will listen to you. And then you will seek me and find me. When," he says, "you search for me with all your heart." God's got a plan for each and every one of us. None of us are accidents. He wants the best for us. He wants to, no matter what we've gone through in life. I mean, we live in a fallen world, and the world throws its worst at us, and the devil does everything he can to throw fuel on it. And we do a pretty good job of helping him out in the process. But no matter what has happened to us in life, whether it's something that's happened to us or something we've chosen through bad choices, God's got a better plan. And he wants us to know that when we seek him, we'll find him. And we can understand that there is a plan in all of this. And so he says, "Therefore," verse 21, "don't be afraid. and I will provide for you and your little ones. And he comforted them and spoke kindly to them. And then it closes out with his death. And notice this is so many years later are passed. I mean, he's in his mid 50s here. He dies at 110. So how many pharaohs have been since then, we don't know. But Joseph is not in the same position that he was even when his dad died. And it says, Joseph dwelt in Egypt, he and his father's household, and Joseph lived 110 years. And Joseph saw Ephraim's children to the third generation. The children of Machir, the son of Manasseh, were also brought up on Joseph's knees. And Joseph said to his brethren, now I don't know if this is actually Joseph's brethren, like the 11 brothers, or if it's talking about their descendants, because if he was one of the youngest of them, and he lived 110, probably some of those guys had already passed on. But he says, I am dying. Probably is talking about his brothers, his nephews and nieces. But he says, I am dying, but God will surely visit you and bring you out of this land to the land which he swore to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And so he took an oath from the children of Israel, saying, God will surely visit you and shall carry up my bones from there. And so Joseph died. He had to ask somebody to go ask Pharaoh for permission to go bury his dad in the land of Canaan. His position now is he's so distant from whoever the Pharaoh was now, he can't even send somebody to go ask if he can go be buried. He just is going to trust in the promises of God that one day they're going to go back to the land of Canaan. And he says, when you do, take my bones. What he didn't know is they were going to have to drag his carcass around the desert for 40 years. But he says, when you do, carry up my bones from there. And so Joseph died, being 110 years old, and they embalmed him and put him in a coffin in Egypt. Now, assuming the conservative dating of the book of Genesis, okay, and I would lean toward this dating than I would any of the others. I can't hold on to it, like with both hands, because we don't really know specifically about the dates. But I lean toward the conservative dating. And if based upon the conservative dates of the book of Genesis, as far as creation and the generations that are given to us in the book of Genesis, if we look at human history, the book of Genesis, from Genesis chapter 1, where in the beginning God created the heavens and earth, until they put him in a coffin in Egypt, that takes up 40% of all human history is contained in the book of Genesis. 40%. Almost half of all human existence was contained in the book of Genesis. From the book of Exodus until the completion of the book of Revelation is another 1,600 years, and that would be another 27% of human history. And then everything from the 2nd century on to the present, from the completion of the canon of Scripture up to the present time, that would be another third of human history. So the biggest portion of human history was taken up just by these 50 chapters that we've been studying for the last several weeks. I think that's kind of cool. All right? Let's pray. God, we thank you for this book. We thank you for the great lessons that are contained in it. We thank you, Lord, for the truths. Lord, they are lessons that are very relevant for today. Lord, lessons of faith, lessons about the failure of a man, and lessons about the lengths to which you would go through to restore that which was lost. You set the stage, and then you completed it in your Son, Jesus. And so, Lord, we rest in that. We thank you for him. We thank you for your love. We thank you for your Spirit who comes and dwells us and goes about the task of conforming us into his image. And it's in his name that we pray and ask all these things. Amen. I forgot that I pushed my timer late. So, and I went over even on my timer. Any questions or comments? Yeah, Joseph. What do you mean? I'm sorry? Oh, you mean the tribe after they settled? Same thing that happened to the rest of them. I mean, there were some, half the tribe was on the Israeli side of the Jordan River as well. But when the northern kingdom fell to the Assyrians in 721, they were part of that. Anybody else? Any other questions? Yeah, Michael? Yeah. 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 If we don't have the option of whether or not we forgive others, because he says if you've been forgiven, so forgive others. We don't have that same option for ourselves. We can't. It's not a. We can't just say I'm not worthy of forgiveness because none of us are, but Jesus did it anyway, and that's the whole purpose of it. I mean, that's the whole lesson of it. So yeah.